Okay.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Today, you're going to get a preview of the presentation that I'm going to be delivering at the Enterprise Data World. I hope this will not thereby discourage you from going, saying, well, I saw Dan's presentation. Why should I bother schlepping to Anaheim? Uh, you know, because there's other things going on. There's some guy named McComb who has something pretty good, I hear. So anyway, what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit of history with one of our clients and with some of the things that we're doing there specifically that are I think useful to the or partially responsible for why we've been at this client for 7 years and counting. So here we go. So there's interest lines about semantic arts. What about me? I've been with semantic arts just shy of 8 years, and most of that time has been spent working with the client we're going to be talking about today. And at ADW, I'm going to throw up this quick and dirty glossary. Most of this is familiar, I think, to everyone on the call today, by virtue of the fact that you come to these things. But for a lot of the participants, they might not understand the terms or not understand them in the way that I'm going to be using them. So, the ontology is a model or a schema of the things and the relationships between them that are pertinent to your particular area of concern. The data, which is formatted as RDF, or assertions about things and the relations between them, they're done as triples, and we use the RDF syntax. A triple store is a database that's optimized for storage of RDF triples. And then a knowledge graph is a combination of one or more ontologies and data expressed as triples stored together in a triple store. So bring all those things together, then you got a knowledge graph. I explain what an IRI is, what a namespace is, and what a named graph is, which in our thing is just a collection of triples within a knowledge graph, but with an identifier giving it a name. So the story we are telling began back in 2016 when Morgan Stanley, our Fortune 100 financial services company, brought semantic arts in to work with the head of information management. He was new in this position. It was a fairly small thing at the time. I think it was just him and one other person. The important thing to note is that within Morgan Stanley, information management falls under the legal and compliance division. It's not an IT function at all. It has to do with the idea of records retention. How long are you supposed to keep things, and that sort of stuff. And semantic arts is brought in as the first part of a strategy that the client was wanting to explore that was going to leverage knowledge graphs and natural language processing and machine learning in order to begin the work at the scale that a company the size of Morgan Stanley has to function at. So the first knowledge graph that we put together, is our pilot. We went in and we created an ontology that's based on GIST, which everybody here kind of has heard of. We converted some pertinent data from multiple different applications, multiple different databases, put those into RDF triples. We also brought in some data from outside the firm, converted that into triples. Some of that already conformed to an external ontology. I think this part in particular, we were bringing in content from WordNet, but there was an existing ontology that at the time was named Lemon, but I think they've changed the name to something a little less off-putting. But we were able to bring in that ontology and that content as well. And we loaded all of that stuff into, they already had an XML database in place. And so there was a triple store function within that. So we just brought all of that in. We wrote some queries to demonstrate the practicality of this approach using ontology and triples. And we did all of that in less than 4 months. So the client was impressed. They were very, very pleased. The readout meeting for that still is like one of my fondest memories of my entire working career. And so in addition to the immediate client who decided, yes, let's keep going and continue this work, other organizations within the client firm saw what was being done and what was possible, and they became intrigued by the idea of the knowledge graph. And so one of the key things that our client decided to do was to basically pay for Semantic Arts to perform pilots for the other organizations that were interested in doing knowledge graphs, because you realize that this would create a sense of support for his own efforts, but also the more linked data you have available, the richer the results you're going to get, the richer the possibilities that open up. And so from his perspective, it was worth it to have us work with somebody for a couple of months to create something specific to them and show them what was possible. And then the idea being, after we had done these little proof of concepts, then that organization would fund their own knowledge graphs themselves. They now have 10 specific knowledge graphs either in production or under very firm development, which is very nice. But this proliferation has led to some questions around governance and interoperability that we're going to talk about today. The second milestone that we hit was, once we had the first 2 knowledge graphs underway, they were both based on GIST. But there was a concern that the perception of basing their work on something outside their control was going to create a little bit of resistance. But GIST is based on a Creative Commons license, but we also offer the option to, as Dave calls it, if you can't afford free, you can pay us a small fee to create a fork, which is what Morgan Stanley did. They bought the rights to create a fork off of GIST, and then to change the IRIs within that to use a namespace that was completely under their control. So this GIST-based thing became known as the core ontology. So that was a very important milestone in this journey. I would note that not just at Morgan Stanley, but other organizations that we've gone to, other clients, when they're not versed in ontologies and some of the terminology, which is pretty much all of them when you first get there, using the term upper ontology creates a little sense of discomfort, it seems, because it sort of implies that the client's ontology is somehow less. It's less important, or it's less powerful, or something. It's somehow less than this upper ontology. And if I can't help but think if in the beginning they, instead of using the term upper ontology, they called it foundational ontology, they would have been better off. But we chose the term core ontology because it somehow seems to imply that your domain ontology surrounds and subsumes and builds on top of that core. That it creates that sense, that a greater sense of importance of your domain ontology, and that gives people a certain level of comfort around that. So there's a little bit of psychology going on there. And so as we've gone to all of these different organizations within Morgan Stanley, we're using that terminology of the core. You build around the core. We also wanted, as we multiplied the knowledge graphs, we wanted them to be able to interoperate. Now, this did not mean that they all needed to be loaded into the same triple store. You're going to get resistance around that. You're going to get some data entitlement issues around that if you tried to put everything all in one big store. But what we did want was for the data from the knowledge graph to be seamlessly usable across the different knowledge graphs. And we also wanted to avoid a very top-down regimented approach, because again, our client, who's very sensitive to these sort of things, recognized that doing that would just discourage other organizations from wanting to do knowledge graphs and ontologies altogether. If you come in and say you have to do it this way, or else but instead, we want to emphasize some of the things you get with the core and with some of the guidelines that we would provide. So when the pitch we would use is, if you're using the core, you've got a proven starter ontology. We've done it here at Morgan Stanley multiple times. With great success. You don't have to start on a blank sheet of paper. And this is also a very comforting thing, to somebody the person who's going to have to work with that blank piece of paper. And we would emphasize that there would be some common data sets that they would have available to populate their knowledge graphs, so they wouldn't have to spend time and effort and money doing those data conversions. And another really, really key thing to all of these is you as a new guy would have access to some experienced IT folks who have gone through this thing. They know how to set up the environment. They know some of the tricks to keeping these things going, and they can help. All of that helps to reduce your application development time. So it's this nice soft sell, come along and play with us, we're having a great time, rather than the hard ass approach that a lot of people just would be drawn to from the beginning. But all that said, we do tell people that we're going to try and stay out of your sandbox as much as possible. That we don't want to interfere with your knowledge graph, but we can provide input and guidance that should make things go smoother for you. So this led to the idea of using consensus governance approach around the core. No one organization, no one domain should have the absolute say so for an ontology that has to be used, or we want to be used, by organizations all across the firm. So instead, we created a consortium that organizations can join, and that the consortium is charged with these particular tasks. We want to encourage the adoption of the core ontology. That's the primary goal of the consortium, is let's get everybody using the same sheet of music, and the data sets that are associated with it. And we'll come back to that bit in a little bit. Any changes or expansions to the core, that's the consortium's business. Nobody gets to go and do that on their own. We also, as we have all gotten more experience in creating and working with knowledge graphs, there were some patterns that we wanted to encourage, patterns around the way we emit IRIs, patterns around some particular triples. And then we also wanted to resolve any clashes over namespaces, duplication of classes, those sorts of issues that might pop up. And membership in the consortium is open to anybody who's interested in creating a knowledge graph, but you don't get a voting membership until you actually have some development underway. Once you've got skin in the game and you're using the core, then you get a vote. When we set the consortium up, one of the first things we told the members then and anybody coming in is that your primary responsibility is to reject changes to the core, which sounds a little counterintuitive, perhaps. But the reason for this was, just like we do with GIST, we wanted the core to stay relatively small. And currently there's 219 classes, 243 properties, which is a little less than double the size of GIST, but it's still a pretty reasonable size of ontology. And so the idea too is that by keeping it small, we are maximizing organizations and domains freedom to build on the core without being overly constrained by the core, so that they can do what they need to, that's in a way that suits the context of their domain. And but you still get that stability and the interoperability of the core. So by keeping it small, it's easier to adopt, and that encourages more adoption. And we want the core to stay stable so that any of the users can be confident that things aren't going to be changing underneath them all the time, that there's not going to be a lot of churn. And after 7 years, most of the structure of the core has changed very little. And some of the things that from an ontologist standpoint, structurally, the classes got moved and everything. So those looked like major changes, but from a functional standpoint, from the view of the knowledge graph itself, those changes were very, very small. So the whole thing has been pretty stable, and the consensus governance has I think worked pretty well. I mentioned that we had some common data sets. So in addition to the ontology, the schema itself, when you adopt the core, you get a bunch of data that you can use in your knowledge graph, and these are things that are used across the entire firm. You get the Morgan Stanley organizational hierarchy. You get the list of the personnel, along with their email addresses and their organizational assignments and their company IDs. You do not get the sensitive PII kind of data. That's right out, but the focus here is on, what are the bits of things you need to know about organizations and personnel to work with the other things you want in your knowledge graph. We bring in all of the Morgan Stanley legal entities that are important to various contracts and agreements. We bring in, there's some geo-regional information. They have a whole set of identifiers for different countries and cities, in betweens, and then also conglomerations of regions, all using a certain set of internal identifiers. We've we have brought in data from geonames.org, and we've cross-referenced the internal IRIs, at least with countries and the immediate level below a country, state, province, what have you, to the GeoNames data. So you can have some really nice links out to nice graphical geo stuff that's available through GeoNames. And then there's some various other bits of reference data that go along with all of this stuff in the core. And these internal data, they all get refreshed on a daily or weekly basis. And then you as a knowledge graph owner can choose how often you want to refresh your own data sets, but it can be as fresh as you need it. And then from the broader perspective, what this does for us is it ensures that there are consistent sets of IRIs that are used across all of the core-based knowledge graphs. We don't have people creating instances of organization IRIs that don't align. Everybody's using the same identifiers. We get consistent results. We have interoperable data. I mentioned that the consortium deals with the name spacing and resolving any conflicts around that. We declared the basic principle that namespaces should be based on governance. If you are governing something, you should get to choose what the names are for there. So an organization that's got some definable bounded business area, if they could claim responsibility for determining the namespace for that area, and then all of these namespaces would be based upon the Morgan Stanley web domain name, which is ms.com. How they beat Microsoft to that is, still boggles my mind. So this has led to a lot of namespaces that allows each domain to define the classes and the data structures that are appropriate to them. If you've got two classes or that have the same name, but they're in different namespaces, then you can change the formal definitions of those. You define, again, within your context, what that means, and you're not violating somebody else's context. You're not forcing them to conform to your definition. So you're not interfering with somebody else's domain or their data, but you can, if you so choose, use the data and schema from somebody else's knowledge graph, just bring in the stuff and it's got their namespace stamped all over it. And so you know where it came from, who's responsible for it. And so, again, that can save you a lot of time and effort. And then the consortium, in addition to providing the core and those common data sets, we are promoting a set of basic design ideas and around minting patterns and such. But all of these ideas are grounded in these basic principles that I'm going to talk about here. One, which I've already emphasized, we want to keep ontologies relatively small because we want to keep the cognitive load low, by which we mean something in the order of 200 to 300 classes and properties total, plus whatever you're getting from the core. But something that a motivated person could sit down and look at and understand and be familiar with in 2 to 3 days of effort. That it would, again, working within the context of their domain, the stuff would make sense and it's not overwhelming. We want to use human-friendly designs for our RDF data. Expand on that in a little bit, but we want what we call informational IRIs and providing visual cues to humans about what the referent is. We want triples that sound like sentences when you speak them aloud. It's one thing to read it, but when you speak it to another person, which invariably happens when you're talking with other people, you want a triple to sound natural. We want to put an IRI on as many things within the knowledge graph as we can. And this is a big one. Any of the names that you're using within your knowledge graph should convey the meaning of what it is you're talking about. You do not or should not just grab the column names or the table names from whatever your source relational database is and plop those into your schema. That way madness lies. We've seen too many examples of these naive graphs. A lot of the tools that are available to people encourage this bad behavior. So the consortium really makes an effort, or when somebody new is coming in, to say, no, you really don't want to go that route. So I did see a question pop up. I don't know if we want to stop or or should I wait?
It's up to you, Dan. I can read it to you if you want me to,
okay,
since you're screen sharing. Or it has to do with the class versus an instance.
Okay.
Here, I'll read it. You can decide.
Yep.
How did you manage creating a class versus an instance or an individual of a class? This can normally reduce greatly the number of classes that are defined.
Let's see if I answer this question a little further in, and if I don't, then let's come back to it.
Great.
Okay. Another basic principle that we encourage people to follow is to avoid declaring a domain and or a range on object properties. This, because not doing so means that your property is a lot more reusable, which means you only have to learn that one property, instead of, if you start putting domains and ranges on it, now you're having to create completely new names for all of these relationships. You're increasing your cognitive load. You're reducing the reusability of your graph. It probably, again, in the thing of making triples sound like a sentence when you're spoken aloud, it probably sounds really weird when you start creating the names that will accommodate these domains and ranges. So again, that's a pattern that we want to discourage. The design guidance around IRIs. I mentioned that we wanted to have informational IRIs, something that tells you something. Some knowledge graph designers favor meaningless or information-free or anonymous IRIs because they're easy to mint. It allows for that, following that guidance that was laid down, that cool IRIs don't change, so something can be nice and stable. But we prefer being able to tell at a glance what an individual is. And you shouldn't have to rely on a label for that, because now, instead of one bit of information, now you're having to have two, and you might not always have that second bit of information available. And you should be able to look at a triple in isolation and understand what it says. Like I said, it's a sentence-like structure. It should make sense like a sentence. And this should be true even if you don't have access to the rest of the knowledge graph. And what I mean by that is, if you're looking at an IRI and you one of these information-free or anonymous IRIs, and you don't have access to the knowledge graph, and you don't, and there's no label provided by it, you don't know anything. You know nothing about it other than, oh, well, that's an IRI. So that's why we like to go with this sort of information-rich IRI approach. So if we look at this triple here, this first IRI, we're following this minting pattern of including the class name in what we call the midfix. You've got the prefix and the suffix, and then this midfix with the class into it. But it tells you something about what this instance is. So this is an employee, and it's and the employee is assigned to this organization, and if you compare that triple, which you can look at it as a human, you can understand. The computer wouldn't care one way or another, but as a human, you can look at this triple and understand what's going on. If you compare that to something where you really do have anonymous IRIs. 09264 is assigned to 12AD4D. Well, we have no idea what these subject and object are. So again, while occasionally the minting pattern that we prefer does require a little bit of maintenance, we think it's well worth it. Because among the reasons, your queries can be simpler. You're not always having to load in a thing to grab all of the labels on your results. You can just grab the actual subjects and so forth and know what the results are about. And this may sound like a small kind of thing, and yet when you are working as a developer, it's saving that kind of time is useful. It also, I've found frequently, I'd write a query, I'd look at the results, and then could tell, wait a minute, this particular result based on that midfix telling me what class it's in, that was not in the results that I was expecting. That should not be there. I need to go back and revisit my query to see how I can tighten that up and avoid that spurious information. So this is a bit of guidance that I will. It's a hill I'm willing to die on. There are a lot of IDs floating around within any given firm. Some that are created, by various information systems. Some that are created, outside of them. But when you're integrating your data into a knowledge graph, a referent thing you're talking about may have multiple IDs, and you need to account for those. The example I give here is, an employee can have a badge ID, their computer user ID, an accounting ID, all, and what if for some reason they needed your driver's license? All these sorts of IDs are, associated with a particular person, an employee. Luckily, the core inherited from just the IB class. So we know how to handle those. We create instances under the ID class to handle all of the different IDs that might apply to something. So in this example here, this employee is identified by these three different identifiers, and then within the knowledge graph we would have additional triples giving more information about each of those IDs, including what system it might have come from, what organization is responsible for allocating those IDs. But key to that is having just the ID string, in a nicely searchable format. So you can say, find me the things that are, have this ID string, and then the identifier that's associated with it, and then you can say, and then this is the thing that's identified by that ID. So you've got a nice chain to get where you need to be. This is particularly important because a lot of times when you're bringing in information from different systems to carry forward with the employee IDs, one system might be using the computer user ID, filling up the column to identify the employee. Some other one might be using the badge ID. And so you need to be able, as you're bringing that information in, to cross-reference and make sure that the data that you're creating and linking to gets back to the referent that you really intend. Another milestone that we hit a couple of years into the project with Morgan Stanley was their decision to switch to a different triple store. And because everything that we had done to that point was compliant with the W3C's standards, once the new triple store servers were up and installed and configured, that's the heavy lifting part of the whole process, as anyone who's gone through that knows. But once they were up and ready, then we were able to move all of the knowledge graph content from the first triple store to the new one in a matter of hours, literally just a handful of hours. And you contrast that with if you've ever experienced or seen the poor crying IT folks who are experiencing switching relational databases. That's a thing that's weeks, months, could even be years. The contrast is just really profound. So the idea of success breeds success, and so as I mentioned, we've got 10 different knowledge graphs under development at Morgan Stanley. Here popping up are some of the areas that we're currently covering. Still, every 6 to 9 months, definitely more than once a year, some new organization will come up and say, we're interested in creating this new knowledge graph. Sometimes it might be that an existing domain decides that it makes sense to create a new ontology separate from the one that they're doing. There's that paradigm too. But each one of these new domains will typically extend upon the core by somewhere between 5 and 20%, largely depending upon the nature of the use cases that they are attempting on their initial go. But we are seeing that as you get more domain ontologies, you get more reusable structures and data. So the amount of that any new domain has to extend can stay small or begin to shrink a little bit. And as I noted earlier, new knowledge graphs can reuse or expand the data that an existing knowledge graph has. And meanwhile, the senior knowledge graphs just continue to expand. We, Semantic Arts, are still working with information management at Morgan Stanley. 7 years later, the use cases that they just keep bringing in new stuff. We want, there's new things we want to do. We need a new data source. It just keeps organically growing and expanding, which is honestly has been a surprise to me. I figured we would probably have been done there within 2.5 years or so, but they just keep on going, which leads to some of these last thoughts, which is that although we have been there for 7 years and we, I think reasonably expect to be there for the foreseeable future, Morgan Stanley is not locked into a dependency upon Semantic Arts. We are not the only ontologist that they have there. They have their own direct hires. They have other contractors that they have brought in. And the semantic technology itself inherently is it avoids any particular lock-in. And the designs that we collectively have come up with and that we are promoting, they're all transparent enough, they're all understandable enough such that if Morgan Stanley were to say, thanks Semantic Arts, we'll take it from here, they could stand on their own and do so successfully. We'd note that most of the knowledge graphs that are currently in place there are enhancing the capability of existing applications. We're bringing data in from those existing applications, but we are not, we do not come in looking to replace an application. Coming in and saying, we're gonna replace you, we're gonna take your job, is not the way to encourage cooperation. So we're breaking down data silos and we're making the different applications data more valuable by allowing it to work with applications from other or data from other applications. So it enhances the value of these existing applications. This is all great. But that said, we are seeing a bit of what we might call legacy erosion, in which new functions are being implemented in the knowledge graph or the applications on top of the knowledge graph, rather than expanding new functions onto the existing legacy applications. This is particularly true when the nature of the graph nature of the data allows you to do things that you simply cannot easily do over on the relational side. But it also, even things that could be done on the relational side are being done in this sort of legacy erosion world, simply because it's faster and cheaper to be able to change those applications than it is for some, for these legacy things. And we are also just now beginning to see some legacy replacement possibilities where they're laying out plans, some application that's been around for a while, it's aging out, it's time to replace it. So the discussion is going, well, why don't we just go ahead and do this on a knowledge graph platform rather than buying some new thing or developing some new thing in the traditional relational method. So that was a lot. I wanted to make sure I would get through everything. This is also a nice run for me for EDW, because that's like a 40-minute talk. So let's go to the questions. I know that they've been piling up in the chat, but maybe we can just take them here. So let me see whose hands are up here. Okay, Dave.
Stop sharing, Dan.
Yeah, no, that was
Oh.
terrific, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just one or two things I wanted to add because it so exemplifies some of the things we're trying to do. One of them, even before your legacy erosion, a legacy replacement, is what I've been calling legacy avoidance. And I think they exemplify it pretty well. When we first got there, it seemed like some part of the whole legal and compliance and risk and tech asset group seemed like they launched a new system almost every year, not a minor system, the 10 million plus system. And somehow over this course of this time, very few, new greenfield systems. So just avoiding that for the last several years has actually freed up a lot of their resources. And then the other theme, and actually the one I'm going to talk about at EDW, they also exemplified which is this idea we're now calling, or we borrowed from the Data Collaboration Alliance, this idea of zero copy integration. When the tech group you talked about there were just spinning up their knowledge graph, they heard that you guys had done all the employees and stuff, and they wanted a copy so they could transform it for their use. You know, still that integration idea of copy and transform. We spent some time and convinced them, it's in triples. It's in its primitive form. Every fact is you don't need to transform it. And they finally kind of got that. And I think a lot of people caught on to that. Anyway, good job.
Thank you. John.
You're muted, John.
Sorry, was that me?
Yes.
There you go.
Okay. Two questions. Have they been updating in the last 7 years? Has Morgan Stanley been tracking the updates to GIST, or do they take it as it is at that time?
There was a little bit of cutout, but you're asking, are they tracking GIST?
Yeah, are they tracking the updates?
Right. So initially, our thought was that the core was going to very much track along with GIST, and that proved not to be the case pretty quickly. Instead, with new releases from GIST, we will typically prepare a little bit of a report to the consortium and say, here are some changes we think should be considered for inclusion in the core, or a little bit of restructuring around the core. But with I think it was GIST 9, that was where we did the major revamp on the object properties to make them all much more verb-like. The ripple effect of trying to incorporate that into the core at Morgan Stanley would have been too huge. Because once you've got an install base and you've got applications, production applications running and everything, coming in with that kind of major change for a relatively minor return, was just right out. So at this point, they are pretty separate from one another. And then you said you had a second question. John, did you have a second question?
Not really.
Okay. All right.
There-
Well,
There was an earlier question in the chat from Louis.
Yes. Let's see.
Yeah, I don't think you said you're maybe going to cover that in the slides, Dan, but I don't think you necessarily did. And it maybe a quick discussion of categories, because I wasn't sure whether the question was, do we use categories to replace classes in many cases? And yes.
Yes. Yeah. The whole use of categories and what we call the C box. I've pitched that multiple times to multiple conferences and gotten no bites on it. But yes, but covering that again in the time allotted would not.
So sorry, my question was about okay, when do we stop creating classes and making instances of classes, right? And just wondering what you did to manage that, right? At Morgan Stanley, if you ran into that case, because you mentioned 200 or 300 classes, as opposed to why didn't you make instances, right?
Right. So two things. When I personally am doing a design, I like to create instances and then start creating triples around them to see if they make sense. But again, with the idea of these instances, I should have some idea of what the primary class to which it belongs is. So, but that's in a design thing, and then we run those by the especially the business users. We take the class names and the property names to them. We take example triples to them and say, do these names make sense? Do these definitions make sense? Do these verbs make sense in your world? And once we get buy off on that, then we start doing the bulk creation of the instance data. But because we do like to have that midfix that tells you something about the primary class that an instance belongs to, you kind of want to nail down what classes and properties you're going to be using first before you start doing the bulk of the instance creation.
And thank you. And the other part is about the properties, right? I see a lot of people writing has a, and that's like too generic, right?
Exactly.
How did you perhaps manage that, control that,
Again, we just sort of talk them out of it. I mean, again, because we always say, ultimately your knowledge graph is your knowledge graph. But we will, try gently to provide them with something that's a little more specific, a little more meaningful, that we, sort of walk through that whole thing of, well, a knowledge graph is about meaning and has is a very, very, next to meaningless, verb.
And and regarding the properties, did you do sub properties as well? Did you get into that one as well?
Not really.
Okay.
Or not in this speech, but yes, but because in the core you've got a whole nice bunch of properties. It gives people a nice roadmap for what they might want to put into their own thing as they expand.
Yep. Phil's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was very helpful, especially like the ideas about how to position things and explain them to minimize resistance, like, saying that we can make existing applications data more valuable, or calling it a core ontology versus upper, things like that, so that you get the right message across. And just for a follow-up sometime, I think I would be really interested in having a similar talk around how you build applications on top of a knowledge graph, because there are probably a lot of different ways to do that.
Yep.
Dan, a couple other quick questions out of the chat. Let's see. Whoops.
Actually, while you're looking for this, let me just say something to Louis' last thing. But there are a couple of sub properties. Anything that's transitive, we usually have a non-transitive sub property version of that to make it more direct. But there's not a huge number of sub properties.
Yeah.
John's second question that was in the chat: are they currently hiring their own ontologists?
They I don't know if right this moment, but
they recently hired a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if right now.
Yeah. It pops up from time to time. Interestingly, they typically will not tell us that they are. I think they don't want to hurt our feelings.
And do one more out of the chat, then I'll go to you, Doug. What are some of the use cases for teams that are joining to use the core? For instance, creating apps for visualization, search, content management, etc.
Right. Um, so among the reasons, is that Morgan Stanley purchased a license from Keylines, which does the graph visualization stuff. That's kind of the secret sauce behind Neo4j. And so, you can build applications using that. So you get a very rich capability set with using that tool. And also you get the experience of the developers before you who have built applications using that tool. So they've learned some of the things you should not do, and can save you the floundering about. And then other things like applying Elasticsearch or those sorts of application tools and techniques, certain design patterns and everything. Again, those are things that are available to you, the new knowledge graph person. Again, just to save you time and effort.
Great. Doug, here's a question in the chat. What needs to be in place at the other internal organizations for them to want to expand on the initial pilot? Does the organization need a champion or just money? Are there other factors?
Yeah, you have to have somebody who's, you're not going to get the money unless you've got somebody who is the champion. Usually you want somebody who's going to be directly affected by this thing. But typically that's sort of the way it has happened there. I think we have encountered one or two instances where essentially some higher up said, I think you guys should do a knowledge graph, and somebody's kind of stuck going, okay. And those have tended to peter out. We would get through a pilot and then nobody was willing to carry it forward, because either the higher up has, lost interest or moved on, or, but without that one person who wants and needs the knowledge graph, it's not going to go forward.
Yep. Michael, hand up.
Yeah, this is really extremely well done, Dan. I like it a lot. The content is very good. It's laid out in a good, rational, clear order. It's easy to understand. A couple of things that I think might help the talk. To start with a motivating story, to say, here's the way life goes on now, and it's been a disaster, and here's why. We've got lots of slides of that nature, just kind of to grab the audience and say, here's what it used to be, and here's what we do now, and then back up to tell the story. That's one possibility. Another thing is there's a whole lot of text, and I think a few more diagrams here and there would be helpful. Okay. And lastly, I think I loved the ending insofar as I loved the fact that there's this legacy erosion and native. No, that's a fantastic way, to end it. It's a fantastic point. But I would think that right at the very end of the deck, have a summary slide which reviews the key points that you made throughout the whole talk, and then again finish on that legacy conversion, because that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah.
And I've got a few other minor things that I can send you in a separate email.
Okay, thanks. I'd appreciate that.
One last comment here from Rebecca, and then I think we'll be at time.
Hi, Dan. Thanks. That was a great talk. In terms of the versioning and so MS Core upgrades with new releases. So if one sub-organization upgrades and then the data in their knowledge graph changes, but another organization has not upgraded, that makes that the first organization's graph is not as accessible. There may be issues integrating with that data. So is that a problem that's been addressed at all?
No, because there is the understanding that if I am using the data or some of the ontological structures from somebody else's knowledge graph, I am accepting the risk inherent in that. you know, that they might change something that potentially could disrupt, you know, what's going on in my knowledge graph. Now, the key to this actually is communication, you know, letting them know I am using your stuff. This change that you are proposing, or even worse, you just made without telling anybody, you know, has really affected me. So we encourage that kind of communication. I don't know that we've had any like absolute breaking changes to things, but can't swear to that.
Are the domain ontologies also versioned?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. They're all, you know, and they're all setting their own release schedules and everything. And then the other thing too is that just because the core has come out with a new version does not mean that your domain ontology has to immediately go to that new version. So, you know, one of the domain ontologies just recently moved from, you know, core 2.1 to core 4.1. So they'd been hanging onto that old version for quite a while.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Dan. We're a couple of
Yeah.
minutes over here, but that was fantastic.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's terrific. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Carey.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dan.
Have a good week.
Bye.